afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another Propagandacast State of the Balance. Yes, I know this has been rather requested a lot. You know, a lot of people like the last one. And then basically a month happened with nothing came. And then the expansion, of course, we sort of had to wait a bit before I could make sort of any real judgment with my opinions. And of course, that's rather what the State of the Balance is. My opinions, my thoughts, my adjustments on the current state of balance. I mean, I'm not going to claim it's going to be fully perfect, and certainly I might be a bit wrong here, but overall I think, you know, this again is my thoughts, and this is rather what I think about the current state of the balance. So hopefully people will, of course, understand that, and of course, you know, either agree or disagree with me, but at least maybe also understand things a bit better. Maybe not. We'll find out. But again, last video was rather well received, and again, there's been a lot of people asking me, you know, when's the next one out? We really want another state of the balance. I mean, like 1 week after. When's the state of the balance? Well, you know, the game's only been out for the expansion's only been out for 1 week, you know. Give me some time to digest all of this. Chew on it. I'm a bit of a mulling about. So a little thing there to keep in mind. But, of course, rather than almost a month past, I think things have largely settled by now. There's been some minor fluctuations, but overall, I mean, things are already sort of cooling down a bit. We're sort of seeing some rather predictable things, and again, I'll be sort of going into those, my thoughts, and what, of course, my thoughts, you know, how to maybe rectify some of these things. And let's start out with the Americans, the good old jolly Yankees. I mean, the Americans are overall doing quite well. I mean, there's no hiding this. They're probably sort of the one out of the expansion that came out the best. They're doing quite well. They've got some rather solid commanders, armor, infantry, airborne, mechanized, scout, I think it's called a recon, and of course the rifle company. Of course, the rifle company is already now turning out to be quite the bastard, which is rather because, well, it basically serves like elite troops, if only elite troops, as you know, overpowered in some regard, because, and of course I don't have the ability, I'm again, my apologies, that's sports balls, I'm actually making a video about that a bit, so that's for another time. But either way, I mean, you know, basically gives you veteran troops without having to pay extra for them or without having to train them. So in that regard, rather allows your opponents, the American player, to flood the field rather quickly with veteran troops, tearing through most of it initially, and of course follow up with a lot of other nasty things. I mean, that one's definitely overpowered. Overall, the best solution I can sort of initially come up with is basically, you know, making them cost actually something, calling them in, so I mean they aren't equal to a regular rifleman squad, or something else, maybe adding a bit of command pump, and then might also sort of disperse the thing of it, but, you know, make them more expensive, or, I don't know, have them replace regular riflemen. I mean, they sort of did that in the alpha, so I suppose they could bring that back. Either that, or, you know, further cooldown, maybe, or something else entirely. I mean, there are a few options there, but overall, I mean, overall, rifle companies largely going to come down to making veteran riflemen a bit more sensible. Currently, it's simply too good, which rather makes the rest of the thing also simply too good. But at the same time, of course, there's also the problem with the riflemen. They are themselves also pretty damn tough. I mean, they cost more than your pretty much any other infantry squad, but at the same time, it does allow them to, a certain extent, also easily overpower any squad. I mean, in Grenadiers, you know, the most veteran of German infantry, rather loses them even at long range in most regards. Or at least they can sort of have the same damage protection thing according to some stats feature checks. I mean, already there's a bit of a problem then adding, say, BARs. I mean, you already get a lot of blobbing. Even with Browning light machine guns, they can easily overpower a lot of German defences head on. I mean, in certain cases, an MG42, you know, can also get wiped out from the front. So, I mean, clearly something's a bit off there. I mean, overall, I suggest, you know, remodeling the BAR a bit more, because currently it's a bit awfully much. I mean, the lieutenant is already here powerhouse. I mean, certainly his BR, certainly, and his subs, and of course also allowing to do a lot of damage. And of course then throwing in more rifle or throwing another BAR on him, I mean, it's only going to make those things a bit more ugly. I mean, in that regard, some tweaking there is needed. Maybe also a bit to the Browning light machine gun at longer ranges. I mean, rather perform munitions generally. And of course, in some cases, of course, you'll just have units that can fire them on the move, like airborne, and have two of them. And of course, most of the American Rifle Corps can have two of them as well, so there are some slightly tricky things there to sort of keep in mind, which might need a bit of a looking into as well. Bazookas are largely alright. I mean, you'll occasionally see players go for a lot of bazookas, and of course that can be a sort of overpowering thing, but at the same time, it's not, for example, that will melt away most armor. The Stug will, surprisingly enough, despite having technically in the real world the same front arm as a Panzer IV, somehow not perform quite as well, but I think that's more of an issue with the Stug. Yeah. Not a big deal though, but overall bazookas perform well. They can sort of force back enemy light vehicles, sort of a reaction to that. I mean, the M20 is quite nice, handy, mines are good. Overall itself, it also provides sort of a nice momentum, but for example, it can't completely overpower. On the other hand, an opponent who's not prepared for an M20 will be punished for it. So I mean, it sort of balances out nicely even with a bazooka crew in there. So I mean, overall well balanced unit. The 50 caliber solid, no problems there. The AA half-tech, on the other hand, is a bit, you know, still of a mess. I mean, it's got a blind spot in the front of it. Of course, most players tend to sort of reverse it in, of course, you know, quickly lock down things. So in most cases on this, the player handles it perhaps a bit poorly or something else. I mean, it can be a bit unpleasant for playing, can certainly cause a lot of troubles, and it can even take out, say, a Puma or some other heavier armoured vehicle. So in that regard, it's a bit of a nasty thing, and I'm a bit hard to sort of say what to do about it. I mean, hell, it can even take on a German flak half-track, which almost costs the same thing, but certainly doesn't perform nearly to the same levels. A part of me would say, you know, increase the fuel cost, but only by a bit, maybe also population. Something like that, just make it a bit more expensive, I think, you know, in terms of fuel, to sort of make it slightly less obvious. Though I think only slightly, even since, again, I mean, I think players also are sort of counter it recently, and again, some Americans are getting a bit more confident with it, which also leads them to making more mistakes and getting them knocked out. So it's a bit more of a tricky thing. I'm using actually less of them as of late. I'm actually using more M20, since they allow you to sort of faster up, push around a bit, and say lay down some anti-tank mines to make things unpleasant for your opponents. I mean, otherwise, the third tier sort of seems a little less used. I mean, it's very popular, and also, again, due to the American strong early games, just go straight on for here. This one sees a little less usage. Pack House sort of gets a bit of blame. I think it could be a bit cheaper, since it's very reliant on its bad ideas initially to sort of get any kills in, and takes a lot to sort of veteran shop then. So I think a bit cheaper there would be alright. Not a lot, though, just a bit. Steward and anti-tank gun, alright there. I mean, a lot of people seem to think this is not good, but Game of Veterans 1, it gains a very powerful ability, plus it starts up with armor-piercing rounds. Captain, always handy. And of course, we got here, I mean, overall, largely no problems. There are some complaints about, you know, the American late game. We need Pershings, and no, you don't. If you keep insisting on, I'm going to have to make you say you're a communist with a picture of Stalin by your bedside, because what you want is an IS-2, which already then reveals, you know, you want to play as the Russians. I mean, you know, the Americans about agility and mobility, I'm sure there'll probably be a Pershing eventually. Hopefully only in one commander, but I mean, overall, I mean, I'll admit, even I have trouble sort of with the late games of Americans, but again, that's largely because you then make sort of mistakes, because you get bloody confident. I mean, you can sort of largely trash your way through the early game as the Americans in many cases, and then sort of later on, you're like, oh, I might have gotten a bit too confident there. There's certainly a lot more confident players, and also better players than me can certainly also play a lot more confidently, a lot less mistake-ridden, and certainly also dominate with the late game, even with Shermans, Jacksons. I mean, the Jackson is really one of the most powerful tank destroyers in the game. Yet apparently that's not enough for some players. I mean, what more is needed? A Requiem for every time it wrecks a Panzer. And the Sherman is also very powerful due to its ability to switch rounds. I mean, I wish a lot more units had that ability, but overall, I mean, it can tear through infantry. I mean, have two Shermans drive up, high explosive rounds, you can tear out squads in seconds. Or switch over to arm-piercing rounds, and of course the smoke. I mean, it requires a bit more finesse, I think, than other late games, but again, you know, it's actually quite powerful in its own right, and I think, you know, that's what some people still have to sort of get to grips with. Plus, of course, some commanders like this one also play out nicely. Of course, the EC8, which is also quite nasty in its own right. So I think, you know, the American late game is actually quite fine, if anything. I mean, there has to be some kind of price to paying, you know, for only having so few tiers, plus getting units with every tier. I mean, if they also had heavy armor easily accessible, you know, it'd be a bit daft, wouldn't it? So I don't think there's any issues there as such. Mostly just some units that need to be toned down a bit, some weapons that need to be toned down a bit. Maybe this one price-wise needs to be toned down a bit, but also not a bit. I mean, so mostly, in fact, with the Americans, tweaks here and there. Otherwise, again, it's a very strong faction, very solid faction, very mobile, flexible, agile, that can play in a lot of directions. And again, I would still say it's probably the best for novice players. So, of course, if they're expecting heavy tanks, I mean, you know, all I can say, you know, is to those who want the Pershing, I mean, if Patton hurt that, he'd probably punch your face in. And I'd probably agree with that. So, I mean, overall, that's the Americans. Solid, no real problems, just a few nerfs. Small ones. Nothing big, nothing with a mallet. Well, maybe Rifle Company, but, you know, ugh. Moving on, though, to the Soviet. Now then, Soviets. Soviets. I mean, I don't think an awful lot has changed, again, since the latest one. I mean, they really haven't received a lot of overhauls. I mean, the ISU-152 is less strange, which I suppose has pushed some other units into prominence. I'm still low roll. We see the same commanders used. I mean, late game, early aggressive play, with support weapon company and conscripts are still madly popular. Throwing in shock troopers, guards, infantry, and then storming in with some IS-2s or T-3045s or a Sherman. Overall, still quite powerful, still quite common. We see tank over tank command. I mean, there's people are still all playing less with it to still at least get, say, one shot regular T-34 before you're on for something else. Mechanized armament company, we're still also seeing, but a bit, less again. I'll admit something might not be adding up there, but I don't think it's the S-35, which some people might say. I mean, I think the S-35 is still a very strong tank destroyer. And I think if that gets any better, it'll get stupidly powerful because it's already one of the best tank destroyers alongside the Jackson, though one might argue they're the only tank destroyers worthwhile. So that's a little thing there to keep in mind. Overall, I think, the issue lies in the SU-76. And I think what needs to be done there is basically its regular attack gets a bit of splash damage so that the cost of range. And you might say, well, that puts it further close to the enemy, which I counter with. Well, imagine a 60 range vehicle which can not only snipe at vehicles but infantry and has a barrage ability and tracking which allows it to see full range. I mean, that would only be, well, make a lot of German players tear up their hair in frustration or burn down Relic. I mean, that's only going to get abused with lots of SU-76 then charging away for everything. So I think, less range, a bit of splash to it, and I think we're alright there also make the mechanized armor company a bit more flexible and a bit more interesting. So it can sort of have a mix of those two. The SU-6 will still function as an assault gun, but say compared to the Stug, it will be less armor, but still have, some recent high rate of fire, and of course also still a barrage ability to be sort of a bit more flexible and a bit more useful, and also that way you'd sort of be less vulnerable to infantry, which I think is sort of one of the more overall arching things about the mechanized armor company. Tank over tank command is still overall alright, no problems there. I mean, that's right as rain. I think also largely it there. I mean, so I don't think there's a lot that needs fixing there. On the other hand, there are a few things that need nerfing, and that's largely going to be what I also believe I called up on the last time. The Max, I mean, that thing is overperforming. I mean, if you compare the stats for, say, an MG42, it actually does more damage, for example, at long ranges. It suppresses quite well as well, which is, hardly any surprise. But it's also more mobile, and has, high durability, larger crew, and all. Then you're sort of going to ask you, how come a weapon that's been around since, the time the British were running around shooting savages in Africa, since the time of the SARS, and how does that do better than an MG42, from 1942 in a high-performance weaponry, which we still see, descendants of doing quite well today, whereas we are seeing zero water-cooled machine guns being locked around. And again, all the historical arguments and all that, but still, the Russians have larger teams, overall larger squads, overall more durability. The Germans don't, so why do the Russians get a machine gun that suppresses well, also damages well at ranges, compared to the MG42, which actually lacks a bit there? I mean, overall, I would say the Maxim needs a nerf of some kind. Part of me would say a range nerf, for sure, and the MG42 getting a bit of a range nerf buff there as well. But also, maybe something else. I mean, it needs to do something less. So either it suppresses less or does less damage. I'd range towards less damage, to be honest. And then, of course, at the same time, the MG42 does a bit more damage, which overall I also think is one of the MG42's bigger issues at the moment. It's really, I mean, of all the machine guns, it probably does the least. Maybe also the MG34, which again is a bit odd considering, again, they're the most modern weapons, yet apparently can't do anything. So that's something, again, and I'm spilling over a bit here. It's a bit difficult here to sort of keep sure, but again, MG42 needs to do more damage at range. I'll just say it here. It needs to do more damage at range. I mean, that's really the odd one there, and overall, again, I think would make the Germans a bit more sort of stalwart. So that's just my opinion there. Of course, feel free to disagree, and I might be wrong there, but again, nerf the Maxim at range, buff MG42 at range. I think things will look a bit more sensible, personally. I mean, overall, beyond that with the Soviets, I don't think there's a lot that sort of really needs looking into. I mean, Maxim spam is a bit too powerful, again, but that's rather what we went into. Sort of long-term player for the heavier tanks. I mean, there's not a lot to say. I think that's rather got to do, again, with the Germans needing something a bit more to punish that. And again, that's something I'm going to be discussing then when we move to the Wehrmacht, which will be very soon. For example, I mean, some commanders might need to be looking into and sort of make it more interesting, but overall we still see varied play. I mean, I go for all sorts of commanders. Urban defense is quite helpful versus, say, Ober Commander West. I mean, there's not really a lot of problems with the Soviets. And again, like the Americans, there's a few things that need tweaking, but overall they're doing quite well. Handsomely well. Again, SS-76 needs a bit looking into. Maxim needs a kick. And overall, well, I think that's it really? Otherwise, it's just basically how the metagame flows. I mean, some commanders gain popularity, then lose them, then gain them, and so on. So, I mean, that's largely it. But overall, I mean, these are the large outstanding issues. But, you know, let's move on next then to the Wehrmacht. And the Wehrmacht. I mean, you know, a bit like the Soda, not a lot actually changed with the Wehrmacht since the last update. I mean, no massive overhaul. So again, which also means the issues that have been plaguing the Wehrmacht since the last time haven't really been fixed, which again overall leads to again the fact they don't have a lot of viable options. There are not a lot of viable strategies in essence as the Wehrmacht. And turning versus the Americans, that is even more potently available, and again, which is why I think a lot of players are currently struggling with them. Not because they're certain less, but again, it's just the same, and they're different from the one chat versus the Soviets, so it's a bit more tricky, because a lot of the sort of things you match out is going to end up in, well, negatives, you know, defeats, losses, painful ones at that. Which overall, you know, makes the Wehrmacht a lot more painful to play versus the American, in particular versus Rifle Company, which again is a bit too effective. So, I mean, in that regard, the Wehrmacht is more than certainly strong. Again, it comes down to, the fact that the attacking structure part, I think, is too expensive. I mean, I think it was over-nerfed, and again, needs to be little less expensive amongst other things, because, again, it really makes it difficult for the Wehrmacht to maneuver, and again, makes them very vulnerable to a very aggressive American push, which pushes them off, and again, leaves them on many maps, you know, struggling heavily, because they have very few options. At the same time, I think there are some units that have suddenly become more viable versus the Americans, say versus the Surge. I mean, scout cars have, for example, no real need to worry that much about anti-tank grenades, short rifle anti-tank grenades, but they can actually be dodged. Same with flak panzer, and to some extent, I mean, thanks to the American tech structure being a lot more obvious, I mean, you can certainly also react to it better. So, I mean, it's not all bad as the Wehrmacht, but certainly, I mean, one is struggling, and to some extent, I would kind of say probably things can lie, you know, maybe more into mobile scout car play. The half-track probably needs some work there. I mean, he might need some more with the machine guns, and so I also think the flamethrower upgrade needs to be cheaper. I mean, it's rated from tier 3, and overall I think at the current price level it's simply too expensive. I think a cost reduction there would help it otherwise quite well, since any players would then be sort of able to react to it, and maybe it's like damage buffs, it sort of does a bit more that way. It sort of has a bit more punch, aggressive punching, and do a bit more to the Americans. I think be a bit more worth it. I mean, you aren't seeing a lot of half-tracks, and so it's because the bazookas quickly wipe them out. So there are some things that might need a slight looking into. And again, the same with the MD42 increases damage and range. I think if you do that, it's going to be a lot more interesting, and again a lot more viable in supporting, you know, players. So that's overall it there. But again, you know, the problem is, and again, you know, how many times we've seen a player go for tier 3 and actually get something from there. I mean, the times I encounter on that is pretty much one hand, again, for months, in particular after the release of the expansion. We got the one with the Angreifen versus Scout, that excellent match there, and I think I saw 1-2 versus 2 where it happened as well. Otherwise, again, I mean, just like before, it's pretty much down to either you go for Tigers or you go for Panthers, and maybe some Stugs if you're that kind of player. But overall, I mean, you don't see Panthers, you don't see Panzerwerfer, you don't see the Sturmpanzer IV. Again, it's too expensive, and I think the 4th tier, in particular with the building, needs to be a bit cheaper. Not so cheap so you can easily rush for it, but at the same time not so, you know, it's heavily punishing and leaves you out in the open. And finally, I think Panzer guys need a redo. I mean, currently, no one really bothers with them, maybe except the Panzer, but as infantry, they just don't do very well. In particular, versus the Americans, in particular with the upgrades, the Panzers simply get shredded. The problem really is, and now they've relegating removed their little dodge bonus the game for them for some reason, is they can't project the damage very well. They have to get close like overgrown assault grenadiers, and by the way, who uses assault grenadiers nowadays? No one, because they have to get close, which in particular versus the Americans is absolute suicide. And really the assault grenadiers also need something else, which suggests switching out the sprint with a smoke grenade, which allowed them to much more safely close in. I would suggest that might do better, or they need something else, or they just need to be cheaper. But currently the assault grenadiers are definitely not doing well. I mean, the rest of the mechanized assault is quite popular with the Stugs. I mean, they've gained a bit of renaissance versus the Americans as well, with the smaller squads that's only a bit more vulnerable to it, which is lovely. And certainly in mechanized assault groups to some extent sees a bit more life, but overall, I mean, there are some issues there as well. But again, the overall overarching issue is, again, taking costs, crippling the Wehrmacht bit too much, plus Panzer is not really being viable either, plus the MD42. I mean, if those things can be fixed, I think overall the Wehrmacht would be a lot more flexible, have a lot more viable strategies, and again, things will be a lot less frustrating as the Wehrmacht. And I think if that can be done again, I think it'll be a much stronger faction, one with a lot more mobility, flexibility, and a lot more fun, and we'll see more strategies against some that might actually involve the heavy Panzer Corps again, rather than strategies which pretty much always involve either the support armor corps or getting a Tiger tank. I mean, mobile defense, by the way, has always vanished. I mean, that Puma, for example, is pretty much terrible. I would suggest that one being looked into too as well. And otherwise, I mean, again, it's pretty much the same few German commanders as always. I mean, some few things here and there could be looked into. But overall, I think that sort of largely explains away with the Wehrmacht. Finally moving over to the big one, the Oberkommando. And finally, the Oberkommando West, which I made a certain series of predictions on, and to a larger extent I was actually correct about them. I will admit I was wrong on a few counts. Sturmtigers I was wrong about, and I was actually also wrong about the Puma to a certain extent. I mean, I wasn't fully wrong about it, but, you know, it's reasonably effective, in particular in support with a certain other kind of unit, in particular Panzer Fusiliers. Though, of course, there's also a bit of a problem there, and that is also probably the only unit I would say really overperforms with the Oberkommando West. That's the Panzer Fusiliers. It has kind of been rather in vogue to spam them and blow them up, and certainly that's something that needs to be looked into. I mean, you get a 6-man squad for 290 manpower that does alright damage, can be upgraded to do even better damage, has anti-tank rifle grenades. I mean, it's a bit too good, but that's also one of the few units that actually has that mark under the Oberkommando West. I mean, overall, I mean, largely the problem is a lot of them simply don't perform very well. And again, you know, the Panzer Fusiliers in fact shows that off, because again, their Volksgrenadiers aren't very good. I mean, just as I predicted, most players are simply, you know, getting a few of them and then throwing them away as soon as humanly possible. For infantry that actually works, you'll see lots of our veteran players say they don't work, they're no good. And again, that's largely what I predicted. I mean, they are no good. And again, I would say the same thing over and over again. Give them some anti-infantry upgrades. Again, I would say give them two. One with a light machine gun, and one with some assault rifles in single-shot mode that can be upgraded to a burst, can sort of have a burst ability on. I mean, the light machine gun is sort of a more regular upgrade. You can then have the assault rifle upgrade sort of be part of the Schwerer Panzer headquarters. And you can sort of decide, you can even have, say, that some of the upgrades be cost manpower that way. As the Oberkommando, you also have something to spend manpower on otherwise, because munitions will always be a huge sort of drain on you. I think that would overall make the Oberkommando sort of initially even feel a bit more relaxed, because, I mean, currently the Volksgrenadiers really are not good. The Panzerschreck, for example, is only worth for sort of helping other vehicle anti-tank defense on its own. It's simply no good either. And it's overcosted. So I mean, there are some nasty headaches there with the Oberkommando, and again they started. Then again, on the Volksgrenadiers, I was pretty much spot on. At least I personally say, and I say a lot of agree with me. Though of course there will always be those disagree, and that's fair enough. But still, the Volksgrenadiers are pretty much just a flat-out failure. They are no good in the long term, and they are basically horrible core infantry. Again, they need upgrades, non-doctrinal upgrades, otherwise they will continue to be in failure, and we will continue to see players basically spam doctrinal infantry. Besides, Panzer Fusiliers is another one that has been very popular with the words to get the scavenge doctrine is to spam Jaeger infantry, very powerful infantry as well, very solid infantry, and again, you know, I mean, that's the name of the game. Otherwise, other players will simply go for the Obersoldaten, of course hard to spam, so also hard to block, but overall still gold infantry, and that's basically what I do myself. As soon as I can, I get Obersoldaten and slowly replace my infantry with it, because they will actually do their job. And again, that really again ought to highlight things. I mean, you won't see players, you know, for example, the Wehrmacht replace their Grenadiers. I mean, you'll see Grenadiers going all the way. I mean, they might get some Panzer Grenadiers if they're worth it, which they aren't currently, but again, that's another discussion. But again, you know, there'll be a mix, not with the Oberkommando West. It very quickly vanishes, because the Volksgrenadiers also tend to die rather quickly in many horrible ways. Even the veterans on, they don't just quite fully cut it. So there's a bit of a problem there, to be honest. I mean, some players go for Fallschirmjägers, MG34s, but at the same time the Fallschirmjägers rather fallen out a bit. They, I suppose, don't project damage very well enough at ranges, and even with the surprise ability, I suppose that most people don't consider them very much worth it. So there's a little something there, I don't know, maybe, maybe not. But overall, Breakthrough, and the other one very popular. Elite Armor, I mean, there's one existing, but again, I don't think it's a very good one, because it's currently very much relying on you having to rely on Volksgrenadiers to be slightly worth it. Otherwise, you need the Schwerer Panzer headquarters for Obersoldaten, at which point you're already delaying your Panzer Force, and at which point you might already go, well, you know, I might as well just get a Panther then, and get another commander that instead reinforces my kind of play, instead of that one. I mean, also another problem is it's massively munitions dependent for a army which isn't exactly known for having a lot of munitions. So in that regard, it's also a bit silly. But that's another sort of slightly minor gripe. But again, I mean, a lot of units simply don't work. Volksgrenadiers, the Kubelwagen is pretty much just terrible. I mean, some players seem to think, you know, just buff it a bit more will work. But again, at the same time, the problem is, if it gets buffed too much, and that's going to be very, very, very small margin, it's going to be too good, because it's a highly mobile vehicle that can suppress. I mean, there's no way that can't easily go wrong. And overall, I think it just basically needs to be a reconnaissance vehicle that does light damage, which can then be upgraded maybe to a suppression vehicle, or maybe be upgraded to a transport vehicle instead. I think that would work a lot better for the Kugelwagen, rather than the current role, which fits it about as well as a skirt fits a fat man. And we're talking extra small. So that's rather it there already. I mean, it sort of largely applies to several units, and I will, again, you know, some people agree with me, some would disagree, and so anytime I've sort of gone afterwards and say, you know, that assessment in the review was actually spot on, but again, the Jagdpanzer IV is awful. It fits nowhere. Maybe as a doctoral calling unit, which gets this replaced with something more useful, but again, currently it's an absolute resounding failure. It is a terrible tank destroyer for starters. It underperforms compared to the Jackson, the S-35. It fails to assault guns like the Stug. I mean, it hits terribly. It can't deal with numbers because it's too expensive. Itself, for example, doesn't have a very high rating of fire. And it can't deal with heavy armor units because it doesn't have the penetration. I mean, it's basically stuck in a little ball where it can't do anything. I mean, the S-35 has, I think, slightly higher rate of fire, better veterancy, can actually see farther without needing spotters, and is actually better versus infantry. Do any of you see where the problem is? The Jagdpanzer IV is god-awful. Again, I will repeat, god-awful. And it really needs to either become an assault gun, maybe with a switch between armor-piercing and high-explosive rounds, or it needs to be replaced with an actual assault gun, then made a doctrinal, because currently it is not working, and it never will be. Because again, you know, and again, that's the problem. The only thing that's really worth is the Panther, because again, the resource limitation and the too many specialists, I mean, you really don't have a lot of options as an Oberkommando West player, and the Jagdpanzer is definitely one of them, because again, if you go for it, you're pretty much going to leave yourself very open to infantry, but also armoured numbers, and guess what? They're playing versus the Americans and the Soviet, two players or armies with lots of tanks. Again, it just doesn't work. It just doesn't work. Again, either replace it with an assault gun or make it work a bit like an assault gun. Otherwise, it's a resounding failure. It's basically like the Jagdtiger and the Elephant units, which barely see any usage, and the Elephant is, alongside the Jagdtiger, probably another some of the biggest resounding failures. I mean, the Jagdtiger as well. It's huge, it's slow. It can't handle any heavy tank because, you know, they'll stay away in most cases. I mean, I'll just bring up one match I watched. One Jagdtiger, one ISU 152, ISU 152 at veterancy 3, 88 kills. Jagdtiger didn't even get veterans 1, I think. 3 kills. Do you see the problem? The ISU is cheaper, but still managed to do a lot more damage than the Jagdtiger could ever dream of. Again, for something that is so absurdly expensive, it does not perform. And again, that's a bit the problem with the Oberkommando S. So much that doesn't perform. And while, of course, there were some bleeps there and there, sort of aberrations, as opposed to my prediction overall in the end, I mean, most players go for Panthers. Of course, there's some that go for Pumas again in conjunction with Panzer Fusiliers, and again, I'll admit I was wrong about the Puma. It's actually reasonable. I mean, it's not perfect versus infantry. Part of me would like it to be better versus that, although at cost of being alright versus tanks, but, you know, beyond that, it's not half bad. I mean, compared to the Wehrmacht Puma, it's actually reasonably alright. So in that regard, I was wrong about the Puma. I'll still not use it because it's still not quite my play style, but, you know, it's not as bad as I'd imagined and told it to be, so I mean, I admit there, alongside the Sturmtiger, that at the same time, Sturmtiger is sort of a blip. I mean, you'll use it to support with the Panther, and again, I mean, you won't get it on its own, really, and if you do, you end up losing. So it's not quite as strong out there as one might hope either. The flak half-tech also saw a bit of prominence, but again, you know, gets so easily wiped out in comparison with, say, for example, the enemy or the American flak half-tech, and versus the Russian, it just needs to be rushed with an anti-tank grenade. I think it takes about 2. And that's good. Knight Bernhardt, which also again really realizes it needs something else. I think it needs, you know, a bit more durability, or I don't know, faster setup time. Even the setup time honestly removed. I think if that's done, I think it'll be all right. But again, I mean, overall, this is seen less just going for, say, you know, the battle group headquarters and onto Panthers, much more popular, much more safer. Another unit really doesn't see much use of the Lux, and again, the Lux just isn't very good. I mean, it costs manpower fuel. You might as well use the fuel on a Panther instead of spend the manpower just on Obersoldaten, which will actually kill infantry better than the Lux. And again, you know, for a late tier light vehicle, the Lux doesn't really do much. It doesn't kill a lot. It doesn't damage armor either. So I mean, it just doesn't fit in there. Overall, I think it needs to be moved to another tier. I think if that's done, it'll be a lot more interesting and a lot more viable. Or, I don't know, it needs something else. Maybe, you know, 2 of the other trucks unlocked, then can be available here. Maybe something. Either way, I don't really think the looks works at the moment. It just doesn't kill very much. And then it tends to just be a waste of resources, to be honest. I mean, a Panther with an upgraded MG will basically do a lot more infantry damage, much quicker, and also be a lot more survivable. So again, I mean, on the major issue for the Oberkommando West, the Panther is simply the best choice. And not, of course, because it's a vastly superior Panther compared to the Wehrmacht, all the extra veterans helps, but again, because it just works. A lot of the other stuff the Oberkommando West has, and again, that's rather what leading to a lot of sort of very little sort of viability and very sort of little variation in Oberkommando West play, which is only going to sort of make it boring to play versus, and again leads to spam and blob, because again it'll only be a few units that are sort of really worth it. So I mean, that's again really the overall arching issue. A lot of the units simply don't bloody work, or doesn't work very well. And the ones that do, of course, then see overusage. And the problem is there's also just not sort of really sort of any middle ground. It's either it works or it doesn't for the larger extent. I mean, there's some, you know, wiggle around here with the flak half-track, maybe with the Stuka Safus, and that's about it. I mean, the infrared half-track is pretty much junk as well, and it really should be replaced with a regular half-track or something else. So, I mean, overall, that's it. I mean, again, as I said, it wasn't impossible to win with the Oberkommando West, but there's definitely going to be a lot less viable methods towards that victory, and then there's no guarantees. Also, the flag emplacement, I think that needs a bit of a buff. I mean, when you can place those on their own, I mean, with the Luftwaffe, they don't do a lot, so that might need a buff as well. Small one, though. But overall, I think that, you know, largely covers the Oberkommando West. Some veterancy things could be looked into. I mean, with the Sturmpanzer 4, or the Sturm Tiger, it needs a ton of veterancy. I mean, for it to get veterancy 5, I mean, at the point when you probably reached it, you'll probably be indicted for crimes against humanity, because you need to kill a lot with it, which is a bit absurd. So, I mean, some things there that could be looked into, I think. Overall, I mean, the King Tiger doesn't see a lot of use either. And of course, it is impressive when it sees it. So, I mean, part of me would say it's alright there. Part of me would say maybe slightly cheaper with fuel. Not an awful lot, just slightly cheaper. Slightly. In particular, since it requires all 3 trucks. I mean, that's still, you know, also quite the cost involved in terms of economy. But overall, I mean, I'd probably rate the Oberkommandos again as being the more troubled of the 4 armies. I mean, the Wehrmacht is all a bit troubled, not as badly to an extent. Again, it's still the same old trouble as previously. But again, the Oberkommandos really has the largest headaches, and they need them fixed again. Volksgrenadiers, Kubelwagen, Jagdpanzer 4, oh heavens, Jagdpanzer 4, Jagdtiger could also do with a nice kick, and certainly also the Elephant while we're at it. And also a bit, you know, the flak half-track maybe is dead, and again, you know, the looks, so many things, in fact. I mean, again, it's not the core mechanics of the army aren't working, it's the units that don't work themselves, a lot of them. And again, as long as that's going to be the case and not fixed, I mean, again, the Oberkommando West is just going to see limited action, and it's going to be very much the same game over and over again. Which also makes it very easy to sort of lock them down, which is a bit the case versus the Wehrmacht as well. So, I mean, overall, that's it really. That is rather the state of the balance according to my opinion, my thoughts, my views. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned something from it. I hope you got some ideas, and I hope you agree with it. And certainly might, you know, point that out to Relic, because that would certainly be nice. And otherwise, you know, if you did enjoy it, subscribe, share it with your friends, share it with everyone, share it with Relic. And if you didn't, well, I'm terribly sorry, you know. But such is la vie. You know, feel free to disagree and such. Just be civil about it. Don't be a nasty little fellow about it. And of course, you know, feel free to also turn off ad blocks, since that, of course, helps me a bit. But this is Imperial Dane saying cheers. Hope you enjoyed, hope you had some fun, and see you all.